the introduction, of course, you usually hear digital cash is something like real money, only it's a lot better because you can use it in networks, and it's faster, and it's cheaper. This is one way of introducing it, but it's actually a bit questionable. On the one hand, there are quite a lot of variants of these things, and none of them is really like real cash, even, of course, not in the mechanism, but even in what it offers to you and offers to the society. And so I think it's better to start talk on digital cash with really saying what are the properties you require of cash. So you look at digital cash as a system of information science, and you try to make a real requirements analysis and say, what does it do? Okay, these properties fall into three classes. One is the functionality in a classical sense of an information system. And then there are security and privacy properties separately. Usually, if people talk about functionality, you will see something with a flow of electronic money, different types of flows of electronic money and real money. If you do this really carefully, it doesn't work out in some systems. So I think the best view of really looking at the requirements on cash is to see it as a system with an interface to the outside world. So we have the red part of this slide is the digital system. And now you look at how does this digital system interact with the real world? Then you usually have a lot of payers. And the things the payers do with the digital system is that at some time they say, now please pay for me. So they make an input pay. Then usually there is some merchant or somebody who receives the money. Sometimes he should also input that he wants to receive this money. Some systems do it without it, but it might be better sometimes if you don't get money you don't want. Then there are always some things involved which you can call payment servers or all sorts of names, but I usually call them banks because their basic function is like the function of classical banks. And this function is essentially to say that the payer has something which you can call money or electronic money to pay to the merchant. So the input that this party must do is the bank of the payer inputs that this payment is somehow allowed because there are some real goods there. And an important output at this point is that at some point, some other type of money, like real money, will disappear at this bank. Like it will be deducted from an account, usually. So that's the output subtract there. And the same happens on the other side. At some point, the merchant will retransform the digital money into some outside money, which means it will be added to the account, for example. And then, of course, outside the payment systems, the buyer and the merchant will exchange the goods. Now, the first way to distinguish very large classes of payment systems is the order in which these events occur. One of the things are the prepaid ones. This is where the allow by the bank occurs first, long before the payment occurs. This means that there is a separate withdrawal transaction in the payment system, like with normal cash. If you say at some point, I deduct this money from my normal account, and the bank says, okay, it was there and now it's gone. And then you have it somehow, and you can locally authorize payments, which will get made when you say pay. So this is a bit like usual cash. Another version is the pay now payments. This means that the payments get allowed by the bank at the same time where the payer wants to pay. In the classical world, it's like if you do a direct order by the bank, then you send something to the bank allows it, then it goes to the merchant and you get the goods back. A third large class is the pay later ones. That's when the allow comes after the payment. That's like classical credit cards are. First you say you want to pay and the merchant gets something, but only later the thing comes back and the bank actually says the money was there. Actually, in the digital world, the pay later and the pay now things grow together pretty much. Because if you have online connections, at least for network payments, it's usually much easier and much safer for the merchant to say, well, if I have these online connections, why don't I check at once that the money is there? And the money will also disappear at once from the payer's account. So this was one broad issue of classes of payment systems. And another one is whether they are offline or online. So at the moment, I'm not only talking about digital payment systems in the internet, which are currently maybe more in the media, but also the things like point of sales terminals or paying with some sort of smart card in normal shops. And in particular with the first ones, you also have offline systems, which means that at the point of the payment, only the payer and the merchant are involved. And the nice thing about this is that you don't need much communication. And in particular, people are worrying, if every payment goes back to the bank, isn't this a bit much transaction handling? If every little payment has to be served by some big central server, how is all this coordinated? Will it be fast enough? Won't it at some time, well, not be available or something? The problem with this model is, how do you prevent double spending? If you say, okay, we have the payment is entirely offline. So you mean at this point, there is some information available at the payer which allows him or her to pay. Now after the payment, if this is fully digital, she could just reset her device to the previous state and pay in the same way again. So if you have offline payments, you need some measures against this. And one of them is to say, okay, we disallow this digital copying of information by packing all this stuff into a tamper-resistant device. So the payer herself can't get at the digital data. This is typically smart cards. We come to devices later. And another way is to say, okay, we let these people do this, and we only check afterwards. With a bit of risk that if this person pays more money than they have and they don't earn enough, you might not get it back. And actually, some offline systems have even been proposed for internet payments just because of the congestion problem at the banks. And so the other thing is the online systems with the sort of opposite advantages and disadvantages. And the main thing here is the red arrow I drew in the middle, the diagonal one, which means that in the end, the bank of the payer must assure the merchant that the money is there. And typically, it's not a direct message flow if you look at the messages, but typically either the bank goes over the payer, gives the payer some sort of time-stamp thing that says the money was still there now, or it goes the other way around. The payer tells the merchant something, the merchant checks back via his bank contacts the other bank, and they clear it somehow. But essentially, it's a confirmation from one bank to the other merchant. Now, these were already the main classes of payment systems from a functionality point of view, either these pay now, pay later models and online or offline. Then there are a lot of other properties you can add to this. First is, okay, you have to ask yourself, if you see a payment system, in particular one with a lot of PR about it, that it's more efficient than some other system or something, then sometimes it's not universal. Universal would mean, well, it can be used for any type of payments. And the opposite things are either that you have a payment system where the merchant is also the bank. This would be, at least in Europe, it's if you have telephone cards for payphones. Then you buy them from the post office, and it's clear that what you have bought is only usable with the post office for phoning. And that, of course, makes some things easier, because the merchants, like if you have a double spending problem, the merchants don't have to check among several merchants where you have spent something already, for example. And also the trust relationships get much easier, so it's clear that this sort of payment system can get more efficient than the other ones. But of course, you have this money bound in the phone cards, and if every merchant does this with you, having a consumer card, you'll have all your money split up into different cards and things, and it's not always a good thing for the customer. Another thing is, in particular, of the more cryptographic payment systems, you can get more efficient if you know the merchant in advance. So even if you have a payment system like where you have a real bank, if at the moment where you withdraw money, for example, you already know for whom you are using it, you're pretty much in the same situation as if the merchant is equal to the bank, and you get the things more efficient. But once again, you bind your money. So you have to check. Okay, another question is, how open is the system? Like, can everybody use it? Also children, for example, or is there some credit stuff which you wouldn't trust children with? And can you have everybody as a merchant, or is there something where you say the merchants are particularly trusted? And then, of course, you disallow normal people to be merchants because maybe unrealistically, but we wouldn't say you trust all of them. And can different banks work together, and can you have different providers of hard and software, for example? And then there are also a lot of extensions which you can add to most of the basic proposals. So at least if you come, like I do, from the cryptography point of view, I would say, okay, there are some basic techniques to make these basic classes of payment systems, and then all of them can be provided with these extensions. And of course, if you choose some real supplier of a real payment system, you just have to ask, are all these things that are listed there, are they present in this particular entire system or not? Like one of them is, are there receipts for payments? And is there a guarantee that if you pay, you get a receipt? Another is, does the consumer get a personal log file, like looking up what they already spent and being able to check how much money they still have? With some of these smart card systems, it's a problem for people. Or also with credit cards, if they overspend because they don't have a real feeling of how much they're spending. Well, for Europeans more, can the system handle several currencies? Are there undo facilities for transactions? And then two that are specific for specific types of systems. One is if you have a prepaid system, where you actually withdraw money somehow from your normal account into the digital system. And this means it's somehow represented on a computer of yours. It might be a smart card or your PC. What happens if this thing crashes? Is there some way to get your money back? It's called loss tolerance. You might or might not have this. And if you have an offline system, that is where you want to go about and pay people, like buses and taxis, without communication with the banks, can you do this several times in a row? Like, for example, you withdraw money, and then you give it to your children as pocket money, and the children pay it for the bus fare. There is usual digital payment systems don't provide this. So they are called cash-like, but they don't have this property. Each time you have paid, you have to go back to the bank and sort of do something with the money before you can pay it again. Okay, another property is now the security with which you have in these systems. And the goal should be in a payment system what we call multi-party security, which means that nobody should unreasonably have to trust somebody else with their money. So the best thing is your money actually only disappears if you pay it. So, yeah, okay, to some extent all payment systems try to do this. At least typically they try to achieve that okay, first thing you could say, all the payment systems distrust the payers. And most of them distrust the merchants, but there are actually some where the buyers have to trust the merchants. So the merchants could, for example, take more money than the buyer actually wants to buy. But an interesting point is bank insider fraud considered with a payment system? Or do the buyers absolutely have to trust their bank that the banks will do everything correctly? And well, at least in Europe at the moment, you can still say it's from the paper world you are used to having security against your bank. I don't know whether it's so much true here, because usually if I withdraw money from my account, they need a signature from me. So if I dispute that I have withdrawn money, then they have to show my signature. So actually there is, even though I hope my bank won't embezzle my money, there is some way of solving disputes between me and the bank. And that's an important thing with digital payment systems. Many of them don't really consider this. You always also have to think about, even if you say, okay, the bank, maybe you trust it. And the bank is not just one thing. It's a lot of employees, and it's big computer systems with maintenance personnel outside and programmers whom you don't really know. Actually, you can do more or less to ensure security against your computers and your computer personnel, but at the present state of the art, actually, you can't get a big computer secure. So it's really quite unreasonable to say you trust the bank. Another thing is, even for the banks, lack of evidence is a bad thing, because you don't know how a court would decide. If a consumer says they didn't withdraw money, and the bank says it withdrew it, and there's nothing to distinguish between them, so there's no evidence in reality for going to court with it, and it might also turn out bad for the banks. Okay, this is the main security issue about payment systems. Okay, and the last properties that payment systems can have or cannot have is privacy. Once again, there are different types of privacy that they can have or not have. One is privacy against outsiders, like if you pay, can everybody on the internet watch what you're paying? That's pretty easily solved if you do have encryption. Like you can do it more or less outside the payment system if you encrypt what you send to the merchants, hoping that you are allowed to encrypt things. a question that is quite intrinsically in the payment systems is anonymity. Well, then again, there are different types of anonymity. Usually, if you say you have an anonymous payment system, it's actually quite restricted. Only the buyers are made anonymous, and only in the payments. So usually, the merchants are identifiable, and also anything that the buyers do directly on the accounts, like how much money they get altogether and how much money they spend, that's all observable by the banks. So it's no problem about income tax, for example. And at least for small amounts, I think privacy is a pretty important property of payment systems. Like if you consider what are you buying on the internet, at least with small amounts, these are things like information. Nowadays, maybe you look in your dictionary if you want to know something. Like you think you have a disease and you look up this disease in the dictionary. If you do this online, it's not even that you buy a dictionary, you might make the actual request. Or you see the actual newspaper article you are buying. So if for all these things you have to be identified, actually there's not much privacy you can have in your life. It's because they're so small chunks of information that are identified with you. You also have to notice that security and anonymity are no contradiction. That's sometimes thought it's difficult to make something secure if you don't know who you are. But all the systems that have anonymity must have some measures if the security is not guaranteed, like it might be broken if a smart card is broken, then you have to have some fallback measures to identify where the fraud came from, so that in the case of fraud, you're not worse off than without anonymity. Another thing is if you just need to be identified for something, like there are goods that you're only allowed to buy if you're older than 18. But then there's no reason to identify yourself in the payment system. You will need a separate credential, like Joan talked about, that you're over 18. You don't have to link these things. And another thing is that you can do fair exchange under pseudonyms. Because, of course, paying alone wouldn't help you much. Usually, you want some guarantee that if you pay, you get goods, and vice versa. If the merchant sends goods, he gets paid. But you can do this securely with pseudonyms. So there's no problem with anonymity from this point of view. Then, of course, if we talk about internet payments, we have to notice that an anonymous payment system is only of help if you also have anonymous communication. In a shop, it's fine. Now you go into a shop and you don't tell who you are. You just pick the book out of the bookshelf and you pay, and you really can buy this book without being identified. If you do something like on the internet and you really want the anonymity, you have to have some anonymous communication means that strips the address off so that, if the communication identifies you by the email address, there's no need to do anything complicated in the payment system. Then there are weaker forms of anonymity. And each time somebody says, here is a payment system offering anonymity, you have to ask, is it the strong form or is it one of these weaker forms? And there are two types. One is linkability. And you often get it in cryptographic proposals when you also see this is a particularly efficient one. Then linkability might be one of the reasons. I don't think there's any political pressure for this type of weaker anonymity. So linkability means that you have many payments in a row which are under a pseudonym, but each time the same pseudonym. So you make, say, 100 payments, and each time people could say it was the same person who did these 100 payments. And then typically you just can re-identify, because at least in one of these 100 payments you will be identified for some other reason. Because you bought with a merchant where you are known, or you bought something where you have to identify yourself or something. So this doesn't make much sense, actually. Another thing is that, of course, from the law enforcement side, people say, okay, anonymity might be fine in the normal case, but for law enforcement, you might want to find out people in special circumstances. Well, I'm not a great fan of this, but one has to present it. One thing is that in many cases, it's only the merchant who has to be identified. So you get some examples where you say, but you should identify people in a certain circumstance. And you can see it's quite enough if you identify the merchant. Another thing you have to consider is, okay, law enforcement can make sense in some situations, but it's also a danger because you have these large data collections. No matter how you do these things, there are some places where data are stored which allow you to uncover all these payment relations. And these places, once again, are large computers with lots of people who wrote the computers and who operate this. And if you have something like organized crime, they can bribe these people who are working this. So in the end, these large data collections might also be a pretty big risk for crime, and not only against crime. And you have to be pretty careful whether you see this side or the other side, and which one of them is more dangerous. At least one can say, if one doesn't want anonymity for these small payments, one should at least try to split the data somehow so that they're not all in one point. Like the bank shouldn't necessarily and always learn what exactly you bought at the merchant. And the merchant shouldn't exactly learn everything that you're doing with your bank, like the current amount of money you have in the bank. I think that's the absolute minimum you should have. So now this was a pretty long part telling about properties of payment system. I did this because I think it's rather important. On the one side, it is if you get a payment system paper or an advertisement, I think these are the questions you have to ask when you want to just go out into society and say, is this the one I want or not? So you look at this proposal and you try to pick out which of these properties does it fulfill. And that's what helps you making the decisions. You don't need to know all the cryptographic details. Just try to get these questions answered. And then, of course, you have to make your own choice which of these properties you want or not. So now that we have all these properties, a small overview of actual proposals that have been made. So proposals now means not just the cryptographic core, but things that are out at least as a prototype or a standard proposal or something. And I've separated them by anonymous and non-anonymous ones, and online and offline. And online and offline at this moment also more or less means payments for internet and payments for normal shops. So in the online part, online anonymous is the biggest one. There are some which try to do it without any cryptography, saying that it's hard to get cryptography out into the world, just to get it to every client. The most well-known one there is first virtual, but actually you can just go ahead and do it. Like you just send credit card numbers over the internet, and you treat it like telephone, credit card things where you have a right to protest if something has been done on your account. And that's more or less what First Virtual also does. So this is pretty simple. You can also say we do this, but we do a bit of encryption. That would mean you send a credit card number to the merchant, but at least you encrypt it in transit. So also, at least if you have something like SSL under a browser or something, you can more or less just go ahead and do these things without any specific payment system developments. Then there are two types which have a bit more of intrinsic cryptography. One are what people call trusted payment servers, which is that like you have the payment server is something which is like a bank more or less, but it gets called something else. So you would say you withdraw your money to this payment server, but from that point onward, actually it acts like a bank. And you have to trust this thing. You somehow exchange authenticated messages with it, what you want done, and the thing does it for you. And then the really secure ones are currently mostly called secure credit card things. And here the basic idea is that you take a normal payment system from the paper world, and everything that usually gets signed with a handwritten signature, you put a digital signature instead. So, okay, we'll see a little bit how this is done afterwards, but this is the basic idea. You just think about the system and what needs to be signed, and you sign it with digital signatures, and then in the end you will get a correct system. Cybercash was the first real proposal like this. Then there was IKP by IBM. And then the credit card organizations took these proposals over, and they've more or less agreed on a standard called SET. So probably, that's why I did it red, that's probably one that might be a winner in the real world. Then if we still talk about online, there are basically two types of anonymous online ones, sort of weaker ones, which are kind of exchanges. So you split the bank into one or more banks, and sort of you withdraw the money from the first bank, put it on the second bank. The second bank strips the identity off, sort of, and transforms this money. Then you withdraw it from the second bank, maybe to a third bank, because you don't trust this second bank very much. But at the end, so you go through a sort of chain, and everybody in this chain hopefully keeps your identity secret. And in the end, you just go ahead and spend it like some other money. And the other okay, there is anonymous credit cards by AT&T and Netcash. And the real anonymous versions, which I will go a little bit into the mechanisms, are things working with blind signatures. And the main system here is eCash by DigiCash. And at least this is sort of the system in the internet at the moment if you want anonymous ones. Then for offline systems, most of those that you have at the moment are systems with counters and smart cards. So you have some device, and actually you just withdraw money from the bank to this device, and then this device acts like a little bank in your pocket. So the bank trusts it, just that you say, okay, now I pay, and the device will deduct this money from your local pocket account. And okay, these devices, of course, they have to make sure that the merchant's device has to make sure that it is interacting with the real payer's device. So there's some authentication between these devices. There were several trials or field trials in Europe with this, Denmont and Proton, for example. There are, okay, well, I didn't introduce mechanisms, so CLIP is something a bit more secure between the devices. There is some standardization activity in this area, which is the CEN standard. And another thing is there is standardization by the credit card companies on this, but what they are doing is not actually a payment system. This is this EMV. It is more a card functionality. So they do all the lower levels of what the card should do, and then a kind of API of the card that the card can do things like sign something and withdraw something, but they don't actually put the things together to one payment system. So that's why I put this in parentheses. Another thing is to have these sort of counters, but to have more powerful devices than smart cards, like devices where you can also view what your current state of account is and input your PIN in your own device. There, Mondex is the best-known system. And actually, you could use all these things online with little changes, like some communication, like a smart card reader at your PC, or something, and people are always talking about it, but it's not really out in the world yet. Okay, and if you want an offline system as the last class and anonymous, then I think there's only one system at the moment. Once again, it's done with blind signatures, but you need special tricks also with the hardware. It also has wallets like this Mondex project, which is Café, which is one of the things actually where I was taking part in. It's a European Unity-sponsored project. Once again, you could in principle use these things online, but nobody's doing it yet. Okay, now we have a long overview, and we'll just go into very few mechanisms of this. And the first mechanisms are actually not cryptography, but are the user devices. In the end, probably that's one of the main real issues, whether you ever get these things secure enough to really trust the digital payment system. So if you think about a user with a device, actually the user has to trust this device quite a lot. First, it means that the user has to trust the production and the shipping. Like if there is some Trojan horse in the device or some bug that this device spends money when the user doesn't want to, this would be a pretty easy way to cheat lots of users with these devices. Another thing is there are secrets in the device, usually, some sort of keys shared with somebody, or even if it would only be a credit card number. At least you have to make sure that these secrets are generated in the device itself. Because otherwise, at least if it's supposed to be your secret and somebody else knows it before you, at least this other person can pay also instead of you. Another thing is that you should actually have direct inputs and outputs to your device. That's the main problem with smart cards at the moment. Like if you have this nice smart card, and even if you believe it's perfectly produced and shipped to you and it's very trustworthy smart card, now what do? You put it into some strange point of sales terminal in some strange shop, and you don't really look at what this point of sales terminal looks like and whether the merchant hasn't manipulated it. And then you type your PIN into this device, this other device, and you type the amount you want to pay into this other device. And this other device could remember your PIN, and somebody could steal your smart card afterwards. Or in the first place, it could simply sign a much larger amount, tell the smart card that you wanted to pay $1,000 when you actually only typed you wanted to pay $10. So actually, if you want to get some real security, your own trusted device has to have a direct interface with you. And also, in the design of the system, this device must actually ask you for every important decision it makes. So if at some point you forget to ask the user, do you really want to pay money or something, then the security is also lost, because I mean, the device by itself can't know whether you want to pay money. So you will have to have some user output. And the last thing is you need some protection from theft if you have these devices. Like most of the devices, you don't carry them always with you, or even if you do, somebody might take them out of your pocket. So you might need some tamper resistance of these devices, even if it's not from the bank against you, which usually smart cards have, that they say, okay, the client shouldn't tamper with his own counter. But even if we have one where this is not the problem, you need some tamper resistance for yourself. Okay, I already said this mainly. The main problems currently are in the shop payment systems. It's this stuff that even if you have a smart card, the PIN entry can either be tricked somehow by a fake terminal, and the other thing is that somebody looks over your shoulder. With the point of sales things, everybody can look over your shoulder. Of course, then afterwards they have to steal your smart card, but at least the PIN is not that much of a protection over that somebody has to steal your smart card, because it should be quite easy to observe you entering a PIN before that. And in the internet scenario, the main problem at the moment is the operating system security of your PC. If you just do this on the PC, and you have some software running there, all sorts of other software can put viruses in your payment system software or can steal the secret keys out of your software. So that's also some limit to the security you can get at the moment. In the near future, what you will get in the internet scenario is probably a PC with a smart card reader. So you can keep your secrets on the smart card. But still, of course, you have the problem if there is a virus inside, it might do all these things that the bad merchant terminal did with the smart card before, like telling the smart card to pay much more than you wanted to. So here's like how a really nice payment device might look like. That is, you would have some small keyboard and some small interface where the thing asks you, do you really want to pay this amount to that merchant? It will have some crypto modules. It will have its own battery, which is needed for tamper resistant also, so that it can, if somebody wants to break it open, that the device can say, okay, I have to delete my secrets because I'm under attack. And what else did it have? Yeah, okay. You can try to combine this stuff with, people ask, will anybody buy this? Because it costs a certain amount of money to have these more secure payment devices. So one thing is, of course, you say it has some other nice functionality also. Like you can use it as a mobile phone, or it's a PDA, digital assistant, or you can have it on your watch. Actually, they have buttons usually nowadays, and they have a small display. And then you could say, okay, to make development faster, you could have some protocols which are standardized, which can run in all of these devices, and then maybe some little tamper-resistant module for yourself that you plug into this, which once again could be standardized and maybe more secure than a smart card, because smart card physical security is actually quite doubtful. Of course, one problem is, again, if you get too much functionality on this device, the operating system security gets a problem, just as with the PC before. So operating system security for several applications, I think, is one of the big underlying issues that you also need for electronic commerce, if you want to be really sure. Okay, a completely different measure is, of course, message authentication, and John already said a lot about it, but still, one has to say that there are symmetric mechanisms and asymmetric ones. One can hope that in the main payment systems nowadays, these asymmetric ones prevail, but there are still systems out there with symmetric mechanisms. It's called message authentication codes usually. And these are algorithms where two people share a secret, like it might be somebody and their bank. And then they have some ways that one person authenticates a message so that the other person can see, okay, it must have been by the first person. But they never have any way of convincing a third person by whom this message was, because both of them have exactly the same secrets. So this is what comes into these, what I said, trusted payment service, for example. These are exactly things where you have shared symmetric authentication between a client and a bank. So there's never any evidence between the client and a bank, but they have to trust each other to some extent. And then, okay, digital signatures, like John explained, they give real non-repudiation, which means if you sign something, the other person has some evidence that it really was by you. And the disadvantage why people don't always take it is it's slower to program. And another thing is the public key infrastructure, like John said. It's a real problem to be sure which keys you have. Even though here it's rather a simple problem, because usually you simply want to know whose key is this, like, is this really money, a key by which money is allowed to be deducted from my account? But still, this is never quite trivial. Okay, if you have devices and if you have message authentication, you can already understand these non-anonymous online systems, almost all of them. That's like I said, these are the things where you look at a paper-based system and you sign everything digitally that you think should be signed. So here's a typical example, a credit card-like system. I've chosen IKP and not the standard set because in standardization it got more and more complicated. And it's, I think, such a thick document I never wanted to read it, so I keep with my IKP picture. So here actually the main authentication is that the client has to, the buyer has to sign that she wants to pay something. And the other thing, this is, okay. And the bank has to confirm to the merchant that the money is there. And actually here it's, so you could say the easiest thing would be for the payer to send a message to the bank, and then the bank to send something to the merchant. And this would actually work also. But here it's done like this. The payer sends the signed message that he wants to pay to the merchant. The merchant sends it to the bank. So this is a simplified model with just one bank. So the merchant includes the signed thing from the payer in his own message to the bank, like an agreement that he really wants to receive this money. Then the bank looks at it, sees if there is money on the account, and sends a message back to the merchant that the money is there. And in particular, the messages 1 and 3 should be signed. If you don't sign message 1, like this IKP and SET also, they have variants where you don't sign because you say maybe there's no public key infrastructure yet for the payers to sign. Then you would usually encrypt the first message against the merchant. Like it would contain credit card data. And you could say, OK, these are encrypted, and the merchant just forwards them to the bank without actually seeing the credit card number. This makes the thing somewhat more secure. So, and one other big class where I can't go into the mathematical details, but at least high-level details are some anonymous systems. And here's the simpler class, which are the anonymous online systems. And they work with something which is called blindly signed coins. And a coin is actually some digital information of a specific format and signed by the bank with a signature saying this is a coin. And the cryptographic trick about it is that there is a way to transform a coin into a different looking coin. So first, when you withdraw a coin, it would be the sort of the brown form. So the payer gets this brown form signed by the bank. And then there is a way for the payer to transform it into this purple form. And there is some cryptographic guarantee that he will actually only get one purple coin out of each brown coin. That's why the information has to be of some specific form. So he will only get one purple thing with the right format. And the fact that it is a 1 EQ coin and not a 5 EQ coin, that's in the signature key. Because you see that the information gets transformed. So if we would say in the coin, this is 1 EQ coin, this field might disappear. But so there are different keys for the different denominations. So these systems can guarantee perfect payer anonymity. So the guarantee is that if the bank later sees one of these purple coins, then it could mathematically correspond to any brown coin the bank ever made. And well, what makes this thing simple in the online scenario is how do you prevent the buyer from spending one of these coins twice? Because we said, okay, there might be bit strings in your computer in the eCash system or something. And here it's quite simple. This whole thing is done online. So the merchant gives the coin to the bank online, and the bank says, OK, this thing has not been deposited before. I'll deposit it to you. Then it sends the confirmation back to the merchant, and only then the merchant gives back the goods. OK, so we had two important classes now. And as I said, there are offline systems also, which I don't go into so much. So let's have some outlook. Which of these systems do we think we're actually going to have? Of course, one of the things here is I said, let's look at all these properties. It is it's for the society to choose which of these things we want to have, which of these properties, and to ask this and to require the nicest ones that we like. But what we are probably going to get is secure credit cards for large amounts, a system like that. For small amounts, if we're lucky, we might get a cash-like system. with at least some anonymity. Maybe law enforcement will say at least they want to be able to get rid of the anonymity, but maybe not, or maybe at least you have anonymity against the merchants and the banks. What you also might have is micropayments separately, because all these things are cryptographically quite heavy. And if you want to pay for every web page, say, separately, which is something that you can question whether this is a good idea to pay for every page separately. But if you want this, it might be just too much data overhead and things. So there are two versions, either to say we take a less secure one for such small amounts, and saying we don't lose much if it goes wrong, or else to use that typically you buy many things from the same person, from the same merchant in a row, like many web pages, or like phone ticks if you want to pay the network provider. And then there are ways to do it more efficiently. I think we will have some evolution with the devices at least, because at the moment you just can't assume that everybody has one of these nice wallets that I drew. But even if we get smart cards now or just PCs, I think that's something where we can evolve nicer devices and better operating systems in the future, and we should. And also the shop and network scenarios will then probably grow together, because if you have your secure mobile device, you can put it on the internet or you can go into a shop with it. You also have to think the security will never be perfect, I think, in particular with the public key infrastructures and with the devices. So it's good to try to get the things as secure as possible, but one should never feel too secure. One should be aware that there are always some ways things can go wrong, so you need some outer mechanisms to see whether things have gone wrong, not just say, okay, the computer says this or that must be true. For networks, one also has to say, a payment system doesn't make a whole electronic marketplace. There are lots of other things like the credentials that Joan talked about, or fair exchanges of goods and payments that you also need to have a real secure marketplace. And well, usually I give this talk in Europe, and then I say it's also there are export restrictions. Most of these things get built in the US. And so we get them with 40-bit keys or something. And I think getting payment systems from somewhere else where is quite dangerous for some regions. So I think it's a good idea to have regional technology in these things also, not to get too dependent of some places. Maybe also not to get too dependent on a few large companies for any society. That's it. Thank you.